Chloe, and thank you to all of you for being here today. And yeah, thanks to Chloe and to the alumni relations team for the invitation. I'm going to start with a couple of notes. So one thing is I'm going to be discussing intersex athletes and trans athletes in today's talk. So if you identify as trans or intersex and you feel like you need support, here are some organizations that are able to provide that kind of support. And the other note I wanted to make right at the start is that there is traditionally there's a binary distinction advanced between, well, within sex and within gender. So according to these distinctions, every human being can be neatly categorized as either male or female, and that's kind of a sex categorization. And every human being can be neatly categorized either man or woman. That's a gender categorization. I don't endorse these gender and sex binaries. In fact, everything I say here today, I think, is compatible with the rejection of those binaries. However, given the kinds of regulations that I'll be talking about today, which do at times seem to presuppose this binary, it might come across as times as if I'm advancing this gender binary. I just wanted to make it clear. I don't endorse it. I'm just, if it does look like I'm relying on it, it's only to presuppose it in order to provide an internal critique of the regulations. Okay, so right. So without further ado, today what I'd like to do is to discuss with you some aspects of the regulations that currently World Athletics and English Football Association have in place. Regulations that have, I think they've been gathering a bit of traction and interest in recent years. Primarily, I would say, since the controversy surrounding athlete Caster Semenya, who in 2009 kind of burst onto the scene. And after she did so, World Athletics saw it fit to introduce some regulations governing the eligibility of athletes, of women athletes with hyperandrogynous women athletes. So athletes with what are seen to be as unusually high levels of testosterone. And I think that the question of whether athletes with differences of sex development, which can result in what are thought to be unusually high levels of testosterone for the female range, that's a question that I think has been very much in the limelight. Today, I'm not going to be discussing that question specifically, partly because I don't know if I have that much interesting to say about that. I think it's an extremely difficult issue, not a very tractable issue to resolve. But I do think that there are another couple of issues which I'd like to bring to your attention today, which don't really receive as much attention. Certain aspects of these regulations that aren't in the news so much, but I think ought to be in the news. Now, these are two unrelated. Well, they're not strictly connected. So you can disagree with me on the one point I'm going to make about one aspect and agree with me on the other, and vice versa. But I'm going to be making two separate claims, two separate critical claims about these eligibility policies. So the first, and both of them are conditional claims. Okay, so I'm kind of neutral in this talk, at least, on how we ought to resolve the issue of the eligibility to compete of female athletes with differences of sex development and very high levels of testosterone. Instead, I'm going to say, insofar as World Athletics, which governs the various, it's an international body governing how all world national athletics federations run their events. If they insist on a binary categorization, then they ought to change the names of their categories. So currently, the categories are named simply women's and men's. And I think that these labels are not only misleading, but they're actually unnecessarily harmful. And so that is a reason for changing the names. The second claim I'm going to make is that if the English FA, the English Football Association, insists on a binary categorization, which they currently do, then I think female footballers who are sufficiently capable ought to be allowed to play within, against and with male footballers, which is something that currently they're not able to do. And I don't think that fact is widely known. It certainly surprised me when I learned of it. But yeah, female footballers, even if they are good enough to compete with males, are currently banned from doing so by the English Football Association. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll first give a little bit of context to sex and gender segregation in sports, and then I'll proceed sequentially and argue for my first claim that the labels ought to be changed on World Athletics competitions, and then argue for the second claim that the English FA ought to allow female footballers to play with males. I'm going to consider some objections and some replies to those objections as I go along. So just to start off, to give you a bit of context, it won't be news to you that many sports competitions are arranged so as to have two separate events, usually dubbed women's and men's. And athletes are able to compete in one, but not both of those events. And this is something that I think we accept quite uncritically. But taking a look at it, stepping back from it and thinking about it, it is surprising that there is an area of social life where we allow this kind of segregation to be the norm. And in fact, there are very few areas where we would consider the need for this kind of segregation. Sports is one of the few areas in which this form of segregation persists, and it's seen to be fine by many. And the idea is arguably grounded in physical differences among the two groups of competitors. So, I mean, I think historically we've kind of inherited the idea from a Victorian period when sports first became institutions. But I think if you pressed people today for a reason that's not simply historical for why we have these two separate forms of competition, they will often say things like, well, female athletes are not as strong or as fast as male athletes in many sports competitions. Now, I also want to make clear that that's not true of every sport. So there are some sports in which female athletes tend to outperform males. They tend to be a minority of sports, but they exist. And so, in those cases, the idea is that, well, no, female athletes outperform or more agile or more elegant or what have you, whatever characteristic it is that translates into excellence in that sport. That's the basis usually on which this segregation is maintained. Okay, so these regulations have been in place for a while, or at least the perceived need to separate athletes into two categories has been around pretty much since the beginning of sports as institutions, certainly in the modern era. And World Athletics has, over the years, advanced various precisifications of this kind of segregation. So they've established particular criteria which would determine whether someone got to compete in the women's or in the men's event. So the first properly scientific attempt to do that was in 1968 when chromosomal screening was introduced. One of the issues with chromosomal screening is that it doesn't neatly categorize. It seems to capture chromosomal patterns of XX and XY, typically associated with females and males, but there are also other chromosomal patterns possible, and some athletes with differences of sex development exhibit these chromosomal patterns, and leading to the question of how to categorize these athletes. As I mentioned, in 2009, Caster Semenya burst onto the scene, and as a response to Caster Semenya's success and criticisms raised against the legitimacy of her competing in the women's category, the World Athletics came up with regulations on female hyperandrogenism, where they said that the criterion on the basis of which someone would be categorized, would be allowed to compete in the women's events, was that their level of testosterone, level of blood testosterone was beneath a certain threshold, less than 10 nanomoles per liter. Now, those regulations were challenged both by Semenya, also by Indian sprinter Dutee Chand. And in 2018, as a result of those challenges, World Athletics came out with some new regulations which were advanced in an attempt to kind of make sense of the available science, although it is very, very questionable whether that attempt to make sense of the science was genuine and not motivated by a perceived need to exclude Semenya. There are questions as to whether the way they looked at the science was accurate and fair. But they came up with these regulations, these 2018 eligibility regulations for the female classification. They were introduced in 2018, and they're currently still in force. And they say that for a range of international races, races ranging from 400 meters to the mile, athletes can only compete in the women's category if their level of blood testosterone is under the lower threshold of 5 nanomoles per liter. And also they must be sensitive to testosterone. So some athletes are insensitive to testosterone, in which case these regulations don't exclude them from the women's categories, sorry. Okay, so this is where things stand, although not everyone is happy with the regulations. The tribunal and the Court of Arbitration for Sport themselves judged these regulations not to be discriminatory, but for them to be necessary nonetheless, in order to maintain a level playing field and to ensure the safety of athletes and fairness in competition. These regulations are currently being challenged again by Caster Semenya. So there is a question as to whether these regulations ought to be in place. That's a question, as I said, that I will largely not address in today's talk. I do want to focus on, as I said, a couple of issues that don't get so much limelight. And the first one is the name of the categories. So the names that are given by World Athletics to the categories, women's and men's. And I think that, as I said earlier, these labels are so there is a question of what particular characteristics someone ought to exhibit in order to be eligible to compete in either category. But there is a question that gets neglected of the very naming of these categories. So they're labeled in terms of gender. Women and men is a gender term. And given that fact, there are a couple of kinds of cases where those labels, I argue, lead to harming athletes and to harming them in a very unnecessary way, so in a gratuitous way. So the two kinds of problem cases I have in mind here for naming the labels women's and men's. So the first is imagine a scenario where, much like Caster Semenya, where a woman with differences in sex development who has a level of blood testosterone which is higher than 5 nanomoles per liter and wishes to run in an international race from 400 meters to the mile, well, that woman will not be allowed to compete. She will be excluded from competing in the women's category. And I think that this leads to the implication the false implication that she is not a woman. Because she's, after all, there's a category named women's. If she is a woman, then she ought to be able to compete in that category, but she isn't. Therefore, the easy conclusion to draw is that, according to World Athletics, this athlete is not a woman. The second kind of problematic scenario I have in mind is when a trans man is allowed to compete in the women's category. So that might happen because they have testosterone levels that are within the range deemed allowable for the women's category, but they are a man, right? And one of the things that trans people demonstrate is that one's gender is not determined by necessarily by one's sex. So one might very well have anatomy that people would deem to be female, but consider themselves to be self-identify as a man. And if this trans man, for instance, is running in the women's category, then the implication again that the world athletics is leading us to accept is that this person is not in fact a man, because they are competing in the women's category. So that's both of these scenarios lead to instances of what's called misgendering. So attributing to a person a gender they don't identify with. So the wrong of misstating a person's gender. And this is a wrong that trans people teach us kind of cuts quite deep. It is part of is an essential part of a trans person's experience, that their gender is respected and is deemed to be what they identify it to be by various institutions, including sports governing bodies. So misgendering causes several harms. There's some philosophical work on this. It's an instance of a microaggression, so a kind of harm that on its own might not seem particularly harmful, but that in combination with myriad other harms of the same kind can lead to substantial distress and fatigue, hypervigilance, and other harms. It undermines self-respect and identity. Simply, being told by a particular sports governing body, no, you're not running with other women, even though the athlete feels, identifies as a woman. That undermines their self-respect, and it also contributes to what's called hermeneutical injustice. Miranda Fricker has an excellent book where she details this particular injustice, and it's the injustice of having some aspect of one's experience not widely understood by society due to prejudice. And it seems that what World Athletics are doing in this case by misgendering athletes is making it more difficult to understand trans athletes' experiences and the experiences of women athletes with differences of sex development. So there are all these harms that come along with misgendering, which make it a harm. I think what's particularly bad about this is that World Athletics is kind of the governing body for athletic competitions. It's the international governing body. Other national governing bodies look to it for guidance on eligibility regulations. It's a very public body. It's been in the news due to the Castor-Semenya controversy, and it's a public institution with some clout. And so being misgendered by someone in the street is bad enough on its own, but when the misgendering, when the source of the author of the misgendering is a public institution with a very wide audience, that misgendering is amplified, the harm becomes worse, and it's seen to be legitimate by others, by the public who view that. So what should we do about this problem? Well, I think there's a very simple solution here. It doesn't take much to change the names of the labels. And given that these labels are gratuitously harmful, I think that World Athletics ought to do that. So as I said, my argument is conditional. So it only holds insofar as World Athletics insists on binary kind of division, binary two different categories for its competitions. That's what it seems kind of hell-bent on preserving. And so I think that my argument, even though it's conditional, its antecedent is instantiated, as we say in philosophy. So it is true that World Athletics wants to insist on a binary regulation. So I think that insofar as it does, it ought to change the names of the labels. So you might disagree. You might think that really there shouldn't be a binary categorization at all, in which case my argument kind of doesn't really gain any traction with you. But it should gain traction with World Athletics because they insist on this binary categorization. So what should we do? Well, I mean, my point was that there are a couple of possible scenarios where these labels misgender athletes and they cause unnecessary harm. And I mean, the reason why they cause unnecessary harm is because they're inaccurate, right? They say of Caster Semenya, for instance, or they lead us to believe, they imply of Caster Semenya, who is excluded because of high testosterone levels, that she's not a woman, which is false. And they imply of a trans man competing with women due to low testosterone levels. It implies that the man that he is a woman, which is false. So what I think there's nothing intrinsic about testosterone levels that makes you a woman or a man. So given that the eligibility criteria are phrased in terms of testosterone levels, what we need to do in order, it's beneficial in any way to make the labels reflect more accurately what the actual eligibility criteria are. The criteria aren't that you have to be a man or you have to be a woman. The criteria are you have to have testosterone levels of a certain kind, you have to have your level of testosterone in the blood has to be above or below a certain threshold. And according to World Athletics, you must also have, in some cases, you must be female or male, or female or intersex in one case, or male. So those aren't gender terms; those are sex terms, and as such, there's less of a potential, I think, here for harm to occur if the labels reflect the actual criteria that are being used. So what should we change these labels to? Well, I've got a couple of suggestions. I mean, to be extremely accurate, what we should change the women's label to is something like female or intersex and low testosterone, because those are the actual criteria for eligibility. One must be a female or intersex and have a level of testosterone below a certain threshold. So it could be kind of parsed as F/I and low T. So FI low T, that could be a name. For the men's competitions, the actual criteria are that the person has to be male and have high testosterone. So male or high T. That would be another. That's a name to replace the current men's label. So I'll consider a couple of objections to this proposal. The first is that the names are awkward. They don't really roll off the tongue nicely as women's and men's do. And I totally agree. Yeah, they're not elegant. They're quite clumsy and clunky. But at the least, they have the advantage that they're not gratuitously harmful. And I think that lack of elegance is a small price to pay if it allows us to avoid gratuitously misgendering athletes. And additionally, I think another benefit is that the labels, if you have the labels where, so to speak, their actual criteria of eligibility on their sleeve, then that'll inform the public. It'll make them understand that when we do categorize athletes into different categories, it's not that we're categorizing them because we think they are women or we think they are men, but because we think that they meet these particular criteria: female, intersex, and low testosterone, and male or high testosterone. That's my first reply. The second reply is to say, okay, yes, they are a bit clunky. So what we can do instead is to change them simply to low testosterone and high testosterone. So this isn't quite accurate, doesn't quite accurately reflect the actual criteria because it omits mention of an athlete's, whether an athlete is female, intersex, or male, which is part of the criteria. But at least it doesn't misgender people. And at the very worst, the worst harm I can think that, naming the competition simply high testosterone and low testosterone is that perhaps a male who has low testosterone, who's competing in the high testosterone category because he's male, we might be falsely led to believe that his testosterone range is above a certain threshold, whereas in fact it's below a certain threshold. But that in itself doesn't seem to be any harm. I mean, it doesn't really strike against the very identity of a person to say, to have it falsely believed of them that they have a higher testosterone level, of this male athlete. It doesn't seem to to harm this male athlete, to falsely think of him that he has a higher testosterone level than he in fact does. So maybe simply having high testosterone and low testosterone as the names of as the labels of the two categories is a way of avoiding the harm of misgendering, keeping things relatively elegant, and at the price of a small bit of inaccuracy. Okay, so that's the first objection. The names were clunky. Those were my replies. The second objection is that World Athletics just won't do it. They won't budge. And I don't know. My hope is that someday they will budge. But my point is that they should budge because by their own lights and by the statement made in the very recent regulations governing the female classification, they themselves say, and I quote, "In no way are the regulations intended as any kind of judgment on or questioning of the sex or the gender identity of any athlete." And so I think it's very ironic that, given that this statement is in place, the names of the categories are women's and men's, and they lead to misgendering, which they very much is a form of harm that traditionally depends on judgment and questioning someone's sex or gender. So I think that to comply with their own intention, the labels should simply be freed of the gendered gloss that they have, right? Instead of labeling the categories women's and men's, we should just change them to something that better reflects the actual eligibility criteria without misgendering any athlete. And I think that it's a change that, given that there is, that World Athletics is at odds with many athletes with differences of sex development, I think it would be at least one step towards in the direction of these athletes. If at the very least, World Athletics weren't gratuitously misgendering them, causing them this harm. So I don't think it's a solution to the whole issue, but I do think that it's a step that World Athletics ought to take insofar as it insists on having a binary competitions. Okay, so that's my first argument. The second argument, which I'm going to advance, is I'm going to switch tack slightly, so I'm going to talk about football specifically. But I should say that, so in some sports, notably football, we have this segregation, which is kind of typical, but female athletes are not allowed to compete with males, and I think that they ought to be. So, as I said, Caster Semenya and Dutee Chand have made headlines very often in the last decade or so. There are some other cases that are, I think, sadly not as well known. And I think that, as I said earlier, the fact that football does not allow female athletes who are good enough to compete with males to do so, that's not very well known either. So there are various cases. The case of Canadian footballer Stephanie Labbe, more recently, and about 15 years ago, the case of Maribel Dominguez in Mexico. So they were both female footballers who wanted to compete with males, and they found teams, male teams, who wanted to have them play and train with them. But FIFA came down with a ruling saying that women's and men's football must be separated, and I'm quoting here. So they were not allowed to do so. So Stephanie Labbe trained for a while with the male football team. Maribel Dominguez was trying to play for a male football team because the female league had collapsed at the time, but she wasn't allowed to do so. Closer to home, there's in the UK, there's a futsal player. So futsal is a kind of a smaller version of football. It's played with a smaller number of players, and it's indoors. And Mamiko Tanabe she's originally Japanese, but she's been living in the UK for a while, and she's a very good futsal player. In Japan, futsal is mixed. In the UK, it's not, because it follows FA regulations, and these regulations have not allowed her to compete with the males, even though she's perfectly capable of doing so, even though she'd be the best player on the team that she wants to play with. And to the point where, whenever she's played with her male team, they've had to play as friendly in competitions and forfeiting the points because the rules don't allow a female player to take part. So I think that this ban is wrong, and I'm going to argue that this should be changed. So to do that, to understand why it's wrong, I need to make a distinction, a very philosophical move to do, between what we can think of as strong segregation and weak segregation. So you can think of it this way. So strong segregation is the kind of segregation that we get between, the categories women's and men's, where we have, allegedly there are two categories of people where, whom you can easily sort into, sort every athlete into. That's not quite the case, but imagine that's the case. Then the members of one category cannot compete against the others, and vice versa. The members of the second category can't compete against the first. So that's what's sex segregation in sports, in football at least, looks like. So that's a kind of strong segregation. But you can also have what's called weak segregation. So weak segregation is the kind of segregation that kind of protects the competition for one particular group. So basically, what it says is, well, you have two categories, but those who are eligible to play in this first category can also play in the second category. But those in the second category cannot play in the first category. Okay, so the athletes in the first category have a choice to play in this category or the other category. Athletes in the second category can only play in the second category. So this is a form of weak segregation. And so if we think of the model for sex, what it would look like, it would mean that there would be a female-only competition for female footballers, and a male, and then a mixed competition where males could take part, but also females who felt like they wanted to and were able to. So that's the model. And my argument is that if the Football Association insists on a binary categorization, which they seem to be doing, they don't seem to be budging from that, then football, I think, should be weakly segregated in terms of sex rather than strongly segregated as it currently is. So I'm going to consider three objections and then close with these. So the first objection is this, that if you turn male-only competitions into mixed competitions while allowing a space that's reserved for females, competition that's only for females, then aren't you treating the sexes differently? Aren't you in some way, aren't you harming the rights of male footballers, right? Because you're giving female footballers the opportunity to compete in the female-only competition, but also in the mixed competition. But you're not giving the male footballers the opportunity to compete in two competitions. They can only take part in the mixed competition. And isn't that kind of a harm against males? So the thought is, if you do allow females to compete with males, you ought to also allow males to compete with females, which effectively means collapsing all competitions into mixed competitions. So abandoning a protected, a female-only competition and having only mixed competitions throughout, which many people think is a bad, has bad consequences. It'll have in football. They predict that it would have kind of a very negative effect on female elite footballers by pushing them out of the sport, because if all the competitions are suddenly mixed, given that elite female athletes are outperformed by elite male athletes, at least in football, in other sports it might be the other way around, in which case everything I say you can just run mutatis, is switching the categories around. But the idea is that female athletes would be pushed out of elite competitions because all the competitions would be mixed, and they would be kind of dominated by the male athletes. So the objection goes, what I'm advising would kind of collapse into only mixed competition all around, and this would have bad effects for female footballers. And I think that, in fact, there is no such collapse, that there's a perfectly stable model on which we can weakly segregate by sex. And all we have to do to look for such stable models is to look at other ways in which we categorize athletes into different competitions according to, for instance, age, and according to, for instance, to ability or disability. So if you look at age, it's clear, it's routine that in most sports, there is a protected kind of category for, say, under 18s. So you have to be under 18 to take part, so that if you're over 18, you can't go and compete with the under 18s. However, if you're under 18 and you're good enough to compete with the over 18s, then you're allowed to do so. So that's a model of weak segregation. And there, we don't get the complaint, oh, but if if the under 18s are allowed to compete with the, some very capable under 18s can take part or can compete with the over 18s, then we're doing the over 18s an injustice if we don't let them compete with the under 18s. That objection doesn't really sound that plausible. And I think that the same objection translated to the issue of female footballers and male footballers is similarly implausible. That should give us reason to doubt that particular objection. And similarly, athletes with disabilities are in principle, in many sports, able to compete with able-bodied athletes. So a long time ago, before Oscar Pistorius was in the news for all the wrong reasons, Oscar Pistorius did try to join the. So Oscar Pistorius is a Paralympic athlete, but he did trial for the Olympics, and he nearly made the cut. So it was open to Oscar Pistorius to compete in the Olympics, even though he was an athlete with. Again, you wouldn't say, well, that's unfair to able-bodied athletes. If you allow athletes with disabilities to compete against able-bodied athletes, then it's unfair to able-bodied athletes. They should be competing against athletes with disabilities, and therefore every competition should be mixed. Nobody thinks that. I think that's very implausible. I think, again, that shows the implausibility of the parallel thought that we cannot have a female-only competition while at the same time allowing female athletes to compete with the males. So the second objection, that's the first objection. The second objection I'm going to engage with is that in suggesting that the female category is lesser, the system is implicitly sexist. So, the model that I'm proposing has as a parallel kind of the model of age. So, as I said earlier, under 18s are allowed to compete with over 18s if they're good enough to do so. But over 18s can't compete with the under 18s. So when I say the under 18s are allowed to compete with the over 18s if they're good enough to do so, then there is a presupposition that on average, we wouldn't expect, that the under 18s are not as good as the over 18s at a particular sport, right? And so the parallel thought is, well, aren't you advancing the similar presuppositions that female athletes aren't as good as male athletes? Isn't that a sexist view? And I think that I don't think it is a sexist view to think that at the moment, as things stand, on average, elite female athletes, certainly elite female footballers, are outperformed by elite male footballers. But I don't think that advancing this kind of model comes with any kind of essentialist claim on, of the sort, a female footballer will never be as good as a male footballer, or any such claim. I think one can be genuinely open-minded about that kind of idea. And point also to social factors such as the idea that female athletes are very often not encouraged as much into sport, particularly into sports like football. That they're when they are playing football, they tend to be much less well resourced in terms of equipment, coaching facilities than their male counterparts. So there's plenty of possible factors that might explain why female footballers aren't at the elite level as good as males. And I don't think that judgment is sexist. And similarly, I don't think that it's ageist to say that on average, we think that a footballer who's under 18 is going to be outperformed by a footballer who's over 18, right? I don't think that there's anything implicitly ageist about that. So similarly, I don't think there's anything implicitly sexist about kind of stating that female athletes currently at the elite level are on average outperformed by male athletes. And the last objection I'm going to deal with is the safety objection. So the objection goes roughly like this, but look, you can't have female footballers competing with male footballers because they're going to get hurt. That it's going to be really terrible for the female footballers. Now, one thing is I don't think this is true across the board. So certainly not for all the sports to which this regulation applies. So if we think back to Mamika Talambe, who plays futsal, which is kind of a smaller, less aggressive version of football, kind of roughly similar to five-a-side football. I don't think that kind of worry is really pressing at all. But if that is your line, then at the very least you have to acknowledge that the rules for futsal and sports where the athlete safety, female footballer safety, wouldn't be at issue, in those sports, those regulations ought to change. But in general, I think really, regardless of whether you think safety is an issue, we ought to let the athletes in question decide for themselves whether they are happy to run the risk of injury. And I think this is something that is done routinely for athletes in all sorts of competitions. It's not a judgment that a sports governing body ought to make on behalf of the athlete themselves and kind of as a matter of principle, as opposed to actually looking at allowing them to play and then see letting the player themselves make the decision whether to continue, whether they feel safe enough to compete in a particular tournament. Okay, so just wrapping up, as a reminder, I've argued for two claims. I've argued firstly that if World Athletics insist on a binary categorization of their athletes, they should change the current labels that are women's and men's to something else. And the second thing I've argued is that insofar as the English Football Association insists on a binary categorization of its competitions and its athletes, then it ought to allow female footballers to compete against males as well. Okay, so I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you. That was really great. That was really, really fascinating. And I think whilst I was listening, I think the point that you made about like ageism, or not ageism, but you never really think of it as, okay, well, why can't an 18-year-old play with a 20-year-old if they're on the same level? I've never thought of it like that before. I found that very interesting. So we will now open the floor for questions. I realize sometimes when we do these things, it takes people like a minute or two for their questions to come in. But yeah, if you have any, we'll be obviously happy to kind of kick things off. Thank you, Nicole. So Nicole has said, do you think positive change regarding sex segregation is on the horizon?
Yeah, good question, Nicole. Is it on the horizon? I think there's a yes and no. So on the one hand, I think it's very inspiring to see the legal challenges that Duty Chand and Caster Semenya have brought against World Athletics. It's inspiring to see them being funded as well by the national sporting federations of their respective countries. And that's very positive, I think. And I think that there is a lot more reflection these days than there used to be, say, 10, 20 years ago, around the need to categorize athletes into, according to gender or sex. And I think that, trans and queer athletes have been instrumental in getting that conversation going. So I think there is hope for change. I think things will change, but my positivity or my optimism is mitigated somewhat by the attitude of World Athletics and other sports governing bodies. Not everyone, some sports are actually doing very, very well on this score, but by World Athletics digging in its heels and trying to fight tooth and nail against these legal challenges. So yeah, it's a mixed picture, I think. But I'd be extremely surprised if in the coming decades things didn't change and change dramatically, in fact.
Thank you. And Naomi says that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you. I was interested that you said nobody would complain about Oscar Pistorius taking part in the Olympics, when in fact quite a few people did complain about it. But I guess you think that's a different point, as it was more about whether his blades gave him an unfair advantage.
Yeah, thanks, Naomi. Yeah, thanks for picking up on that. Yes, you're absolutely right. It wasn't a race without controversy. But you're right. The controversy. I totally agree with you. Yeah, the controversy was around whether Oscar Pistorius was enjoying a competitive advantage because of the blades that he was using. So imagine he wasn't using any controversial piece of equipment. Imagine everyone agreed that whatever equipment he was using was perfectly fine. I think if you kind of neutralize that aspect, that kind of noise that's coming in, I think you know, my thought goes through that nobody would have complained about Oscar Pistorius simply in virtue of having a disability competing against other Olympic athletes.
Cool, thank you. Our next one is from Ian, who says, are the likes of boxing and potentially progressive in using categories based simply on weight in pounds or kilos?
Yeah, nice question. Hi, Ian. Nice to see you. Yeah, boxing is a funny one. Do I see them as potentially progressive? There's actually, so I'm not sure if this will answer your question. There's a philosopher called Torbjörn Tansjö who's argued that, in fact, we should take inspiration from sports like boxing, and we should stop focusing so much on sex or gender, and simply abandon those categories and only have categories that are based on things like weight in boxing and other kind of physical characteristics in other sports, perhaps height in basketball, or I don't know, muscle mass in weightlifting. So I don't know exactly how the details should go, but he argues that the mistake in focusing on sex and gender is that sex and gender are only indirectly related to performance, whereas there are these other characteristics like height and weight, agility perhaps, that are more directly related to, or directly related to performance. And that it's only legitimate to categorize on the basis of these characteristics that directly influence performance. And so he argues that all sports should be mixed, right? He doesn't think there should be any sex or gender categories. I don't agree with that argument. Sorry, neither does my dog. I think that, yeah, so I don't agree with that argument because I don't think that you can draw so easily a distinction between characteristics that directly influence performance versus those that don't. So I also think, of course, just because a boxer weighs more, that doesn't mean that they're going to be a better boxer. Just because a basketball is taller, that doesn't make them a better basketball player. It just depends. But more broadly, I think focusing on weight in pounds or kilograms, I think it's kind of, let me put it this way. So I think the World Athletics are using something like weight or kilograms in boxing as a proxy for sex or gender. So they're using testosterone levels. And I think that's certainly a better measure than other measures. I mean, I don't think it's a great measure necessarily. And in fact, I'm not fully convinced that it is a legitimate measure, but it's certainly not it's certainly a physical measure and not a measure that, well, traditionally used to be kind of, the labels themselves suggest women's and men's, which are not physical features, right? So I think to the extent that it's insisting on physical features, it is slightly more on point, right? I mean, it's slightly more on target than regulations that go by non-physical features like gender. I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's the best I can do just now.
Thank you. So next one's from Colin, who says, it's interesting to consider the problem from two angles. Your approach starts with the individual exceptions to the rule. The administrators consider things more globally with key considerations of fairness of competition, safety for participants, and acceptability to other competitors. So I guess that's kind of more of a comment and a question, but I'll let you respond.
Yeah, I agree. As a philosopher, I'm kind of drawn to the exceptions. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Those are fairness and safety are the considerations that are explicitly adduced by sports governing bodies when they advance or defend their sex or gender-based or testosterone-based, effectively, categorizations. The acceptability to other competitors is something that doesn't get explicitly mentioned by sports governing bodies, but it's definitely something that's going on, right? What I think what started the Semenya controversy was the fact that other women athletes in the same competitions were very unhappy, were deeply unhappy about Semenya's eligibility to compete. The trouble, I mean, on this point, I think there's this broader point that any change we make in the regulations is going to upset somebody. Somebody stands to win and somebody stands to lose. And I don't think that acceptability to other competitors ought to be given as much weight as sports governing bodies have been given. But then again, that's easy for me to say. I'm not representing the interests of said competitors. So I do recognize that sports governing bodies have to weigh up various interests, and that it's not easy to come to a solution. But I totally agree that that's where they're coming from.
Thanks. And Adam has said, thanks, a thoroughly enjoyable discussion. I am fully supportive of your proposal regarding the football categories and weak segregation. On the IAAF point, how prevalent do you feel the situation is? We all know about Semenya, and there are a few other notable examples, but do you think this area requires urgent attention? An argument that I hear against your point from others I've discussed this with are that the population that this affects is so minimal in comparison.
Yeah, interesting point, Adam. I don't know to what. So just to clarify, IAAF is the former name of World Athletics. So they went through a name change recently. So do I think this area needs urgent attention? Yes, I do. It is you think it's a small number of people? Yeah. Population this affects is so minimal in comparison. It is relatively small. So according to scientific estimates, people with differences of sex development, kind of the numbers vary depending on who you listen to, between 0.018% of the population, 1% of the population. So I mean, potentially it could be quite a large number, but yes, many of those won't be athletes. Trans people are in the minority. I think a majority of people are cisgendered, but just because it's a small number of people, let me say one thing. So firstly, the changing the labels, I think perhaps there's a small number of people who are directly affected, but I'm not so sure. I mean, think of aspiring athletes as well. Okay, who see, for example, who are trans or who have differences in sex development, who see Caster Semenya, for instance, or trans athletes being misgendered. Even though they themselves might not be misgendered, I think it does contribute to a general feeling of not being, institutions not listening to you or not taking your group's points of view seriously. So I think it might be a larger number than you make out to be here. The other thing, what was I going to say? Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the second argument I made about weakly segregating. Oh yeah, sorry. So yours is on the I. So I won't address that. I think I've addressed the IAAF point. Yeah, I think it's a larger number than you think, not just because of the athletes directly involved, but because of their visibility and people from the same groups, seeing that World Athletics isn't kind of listening to their fellow group members.
Cool. And Adam has just said, thanks, a very helpful response. And the point on impact on aspiring athletes is important. Totally agree. And Colin has said, I agree that testosterone is a simplistic approach to use as victimizing characteristic.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm as I said, I really don't have a well worked out view on whether testosterone-based system is the best we could get. But insofar as World Athletics insist on that, then they ought to change their labels. Can I just return to the previous points, Adam's points, just 1 second? I also wanted to underline something else, that I think that on the visibility issue, the World Athletics tend to set the standard. So national governing bodies tend to look to World Athletics, and smaller organizations tend to look to national governing bodies. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which these regulations can, in trickling down through sports governing bodies of various sizes, can actually have an effect closer to the ground. And just generally, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, I mean, I think it's considered to be normal, but I think it still strikes me sometimes when I think of it as very unusual, is that these kinds of distinctions between, in dividing athletes into different categories depending on their sex, gender, happen even before puberty, right? Even in schools. Think back to your own school time. I mean, I think it was very likely that if you were of one sex or one gender, you were placed in a particular sport or encouraged into a particular sport, whereas another sex or another gender would have been encouraged into different sports. So I think these kinds of regulations do tend to filter down even outside institutional sport and into schools and education. So I think it is important that we get these things right, even if they seem to be harming over only a small number of people.
Thank you. I'll just leave it there in case anyone does have any questions, any further questions. I was going to ask, obviously you kind of just said that like the IAAF is potentially the organisation that other governing bodies like look towards. But do you see it in the moment, like any particular sports addressing this or trying to kind of progress and change things more than others are? Like, are there any kind of examples that are leading the way, I guess?
I have to say, I'm not an expert on sports, so there might be audience members who know more than I do. I know roller derby is doing incredible work on this. So roller derby is not a very well-known sport. It involves skating and going around a rink and trying to knock your opponents off stride. But it does kind of totally subvert the sex gender binary. It's a very inclusive sport, and I think it is so because people who were involved in its organization from the start were very highly aware of the potential, the damaging, the kind of implicit stereotypes that sex gender categorizations in sports rely on. So they were kind of keen to subvert those.
Thank you. And Adam just said, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the recent World Rugby regulations in this area, but that might take longer to dissect.
It might do, particularly because I don't know them very well. So you would have to tell me exactly what they are. So perhaps left to a different occasion.
Yeah, I know I'm also not aware actually either. So I don't know. Maybe Adam, we could maybe add something into.
Or feel free to email me separately. I'd be very happy to have email correspondence with you.
Great, thank you. Well, again, leave it there just in case there are any other questions. And if there aren't, we can kind of just conclude things there today. Like waiting and seeing. Yeah, we'll kind of, it seems like our kind of questions and comments have maybe kind of concluded nicely there. So thank you very much, Fed, for taking us through that today. I think it's a really, really fascinating topic, and it was interesting to kind of hear more. So thank you very much for taking the time, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your kind of evenings or afternoons, wherever you're joining us from. So thank you.
Thanks everyone.